Good evening, and thank you, Professor Abulafia, for being with us. Thank you for your time. Even though it may not be necessary, I would like to briefly introduce you to our audience before asking you a few questions. David Abulafia is a British historian of international acclaim, specializing in the history of the Mediterranean, medieval Europe, and maritime history. Emeritus Professor of the Mediterranean History at the University of Cambridge and Fellow of Gonville and Caius College. He is also member of the British Academy. Abulafia's research explores the interactions between civilizations across the Mediterranean, focusing on trade routes, maritime empires, and the meeting of different cultures over the centuries. He's regarded as one of the foremost authorities on Mediterranean history. Among his significant works are The Great Sea, Human History of the Mediterranean, maybe your masterpiece, I would say, The Boundless Sea, Human History of the Ocean, and the Revolutionary Biography of Frederick II, a medieval emperor. So first question for you, Professor Abulafia. From your research perspective, would it be reasonable to say that maritime routes have played a more influential role than land routes throughout human history? And if so, could you explain us why, maybe giving us some examples, because I can understand this question is maybe huge.
It's a huge question, and the answer is appropriately huge because you have to consider that 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by water. So the oceans provide this space, obviously, through which human beings can travel in their ships. But beyond that, there's also the fact that shipping, moving ships across the sea, has for so many centuries been much easier than moving goods, I should say, across land. And we see this nowadays in the fact that 80 or 85%, you can play around with the statistics, of world trade is actually conducted by sea. And those container ships which come from China with nowadays tens of thousands, well, I exaggerate a bit, up to 23,000, I think is the maximum, of these units, these containers or half containers. It's extraordinary how much traffic goes by sea. And if we go back in time and we actually look at the relations between the different continents, these were so often maintained by sea. We hear a lot nowadays. There was an exhibition, for instance, in Venice last year about Marco Polo and the Silk Road. And people talk about the Silk Road as if it's something that crosses Eurasia by land, but much more important than the routes over land, which were constantly interrupted, which were slow, dangerous, full of bandits, mountains, obstacles, deserts. The routes by sea, despite the dangers that they presented, if you go back to the 13th century, were actually safer. They were the routes that merchants preferred to take. Now, there was a sort of risk which was far beyond the sort of risk that we would regard as acceptable if we were, for instance, taking an air journey nowadays. But it was something that was sort of factored in. I mean, one has to remember that perhaps businessmen like taking risks, so traders would tend to tolerate that level of risk. And although we hear so much about shipwrecks, we also have to understand what these statistics about shipwrecks mean. When people say around 1500 that that ships really didn't survive these voyages, that 1/8 of all the ships or something like that sank trying to get from Europe to the Caribbean, what they're talking about is the whole life of a ship. So these ships might have gone back and forth 10 times before they sank. So you have to start multiplying the figures, and you realize that actually for the times, it was a tolerable risk.
Okay, so there is this tension between land routes and maritime routes. There is another tension, we could say, between ocean and the Mediterranean, so the closed sea. Given your extensive research on maritime history, could you explain how the Mediterranean, with its enclosed geography and dense coastal civilizations, differs from the vast and open nature of the ocean in influencing patterns of trade and cultural interactions and political power throughout history?
One of the extraordinary things about the Mediterranean, it's always seemed to me, is that a sea which is so small has had so much influence. So people will often talk, when they talk about the oceans, they'll sometimes include the Mediterranean as if it is another ocean. But of course, the layout is totally different. It's enclosed, it only has a few exit points, the Strait of Gibraltar, the route past Istanbul, and nowadays the Suez Canal. And all it accounts for is 0.8% of the maritime surface of the Earth. And just think of that, it is less than 1% of the maritime surface, which is predominantly oceanic. So what is it about the Mediterranean? And the point about the Mediterranean, if you look at it, it is long and narrow, so it's relatively easy to get from the northern shores to the southern shores. And it's also actually not so dangerous getting from the extreme east to the extreme west, because there are lots of stopping points. The very irregular shape of the Mediterranean, with Greece sticking out, with Italy sticking out, with the islands. The islands are tremendously important. I mean, the Aegean is full of islands, but the Western Mediterranean as well, with these large islands, notably Sicily and Sardinia. This is a space which is made for human communication. So that is an essential part of it, that it's always been an area which has been, particularly in the summer, quite easy to cross. In the winter, as we know, there can be serious storms. Navigating the Mediterranean was something which was not always well advised, let's say, in the Middle Ages. But even so, people did so. So it's really enabled these three continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa, to meet together in a way that doesn't really work for other maritime spaces. There's nothing like that, really. I mean, there are other seas that I've sometimes described as Mediterraneans. People talk of the Baltic sometimes as a Mediterranean. But the point about our Mediterranean, the real Mediterranean, is the way in which it's acted as a sort of magnet, drawing all these civilizations around its shores and enabling them to interact with one another.
The Mediterranean is also, I think it built in the past the European identity, we could say. You mentioned the three continents. Now I would like to focus on Europe. Nowadays we could say that there are at least two European identities, the continental and the Mediterranean. Could you explain the difference between these two identities, how they differ in essence? Maybe today the continental one is stronger than the Mediterranean because the centers, the economic centers, the cities which are the most important in Europe are continental, I think, for example, Brussels, Strasbourg, and so on, the center, the political center.
You know, I think the Mediterranean has, as it were, lost in that competition between these two identities, Mediterranean and European. And one very important and obvious reason for it is the creation of the European Union, which has drawn the attention of the European countries on the northern shores of the Mediterranean Sea towards Brussels, as you say. And this actually has led to a disengagement with the Mediterranean at times, which was accentuated if we go back, just looking at recent history, if we go back to the 1950s and 60s, the period when decolonization was underway, when North Africa, which after all had since the late 19th century acquired this very distinctive character. The whole of the coast of North Africa consisted of colonial possessions of the different European powers, a little bit for Spain, most of it for France, but also Britain having a major stake as well. And the disengagement which took place with decolonization, those countries, of course, most of them were wary of building very close ties with the Europeans. The Algerians, for instance, had difficulties with France. They saw France as their persecutor, which had for a long time refused to give them the political freedom they required. So the result of this was a further degree of disengagement, and others moving in, the Soviet Union moving in, trying to build its power, not entirely successfully within the Mediterranean. So I think in recent history, this fracturing of the Mediterranean has been accentuated. And in a funny way, you know, colonialism, for all its evils, it did bring the North and the South together. So if you go to a city like Tunis nowadays, you have all these French buildings and so on. Right next door to the Medina, the Kasbah, you have very imposing buildings which could be, in Paris you have cathedrals, you have all sorts of things. So it's that sort of sense that the attempts to build a common Mediterranean at that point failed. We know, if we go back 100 years, we know that in, for instance, the University of Algiers, there was a very active, very eloquent group of ancient historians, archaeologists and so on, who were constantly emphasizing the importance of the Roman Mare Nostrum. And that, of course, also had echoes in Mussolini's policies, though he was mainly interested in what he could do for Italy, whereas these people were talking rather more broadly, actually. Now, Mare Nostrum was an echo of this extraordinary fact that for several hundred years, the Roman Empire controlled politically the whole of the Mediterranean pretty well. And so that is something which has never been replicated. Whether any of this in more recent times, in the 19th, 20th centuries, contributed to a sense of Mediterranean identity seems to me rather doubtful. So I would say a lot of what we see nowadays, it's the result of political pressures. I've mentioned the European Union. I mean, there are other factors, NATO, for instance, which, I mean, we have to bear in mind the presence of Turkey in NATO, but otherwise, again, countries really wanting to form a very solid bloc originally against Soviet expansion. And that again created a sense of sort of common European purpose, which remains even after Great Britain has left the European Union. Britain still certainly is very much part of that way of thinking.
Okay, but there are also some changes, I mean, geopolitical changes today. So given these geopolitical changes, I think, for example, to migration flows or the growing demographic pressures from Africa, do you think Europe's borders might now be shifting southward once again? Because in the previous question I said that these borders are cities like Brussels, Strasbourg and so on. Given these geopolitical changes, what do you think?
Well, I think that the European Union in particular has recognized that it has to engage much more with the Mediterranean, with the whole Mediterranean. There are, of course, overriding problems that, in the case of some countries, including some countries on the northern side, like Albania, this raises their aspiration to become part of the Mediterranean. And even Morocco, in the very early days of the European Economic Community, I think it was an associate member. I'm not sure what they got from that, but So there's always been this sense that getting into the European community was a tremendously important objective. Turkey, of course, though it's broken with that nowadays, but for a long time seemed extremely ambitious to join the European Union. So we're looking at a situation where I think there are a lot of sort of practical obstacles, a lot of them to do with economic development. I mean, Morocco still has a very long way to achieve the standard of living across the population that's been achieved in nearly all of Europe. So, so those barriers, possibly if the European countries could do more to try and sort of build the economies of these countries. But in the current economic situation, it's difficult. In the current also strategic situation, given the very radical changes that have taken place just within a few years in the relationship between Europe and Russia. And also we can bring China into the picture as well to some extent. And the developments in the Middle East, which have been extremely unsettling. So we are looking at a very turbulent phase at the moment. And the idea of getting everybody to sit around the same table and really participate in a common discussion seems, it's an aspiration.
So I would like to ask you, how do you distinguish between the myth and the historical reality in the Mediterranean context when we talk about convivencia?
It's a very good question, because I think that in my book, The Great Sea, I was sometimes perhaps rather romantically inclined towards a nostalgic view of the way in which these relationships worked. But the reality is, on the ground, even though we have these stories of inter-community violence and things like this, that by and large, communities, mixed communities in cities like what you mentioned, Smyrna before 1922, Alexandria, Salonika, and so on. This was something which seemed to work quite well. Different communities would have a different sense of whether they wanted to mix with one another or not. But taking these places as a whole, there was a great deal of cross-cultural contact. There was a sense also that those in government were themselves very keen on promoting that sort of cross-cultural contact. One of the issues I raise in my book about the Mediterranean, looking at Alexandria, there's this prince who he's, I don't know, the brother, cousin, or whatever of the king. And he will go around, he will open the Italian hospital, he will visit the Jewish school, he'll do something with the Greeks, maybe just go to their wonderful pastry shops or whatever. And he very much values that role. You see a bit of it still in Morocco, where the king is always very solicitous about the Jewish community, such as it is, and so on. You know, sort of trying to perpetuate something of that, but there's not much else that he can really sort of promote from the point of view of convivencia. So I think what we're looking at there is if you like, a civilization, I'd like to use that word, I think, which has vanished. And it vanished in consequence of the enormous turbulence that was created by strongly nationalistic movements. So this begins in the 1820s already with Greek independence. And then following on from that, even though large areas of Greece were only acquired at the beginning of the 20th century, then you find, of course, with the emergence of Turkey, Ataturk and his program, that's the end of Smyrna. That is, we see this hideous outcome for the Greeks and the Armenians in particular, and it becomes a monolithic Turkish city. And Alexandria under Nasser in the 1950s, as a result of the overthrow of the Egyptian monarchy, everything goes in the other direction entirely. And then the Suez War, which led to the expulsion of the Jews, but already the Greeks were under pressure, the Italians were under pressure. who had made Alexandria, or at least the nice parts of Alexandria, into this gracious, rather European city. And all of that has vanished. There's some tiny spots around the Mediterranean where perhaps you can find it, but that is a lost world. So one does feel nostalgic for that.
We talk about the recent history, so I would like to ask you today, which is the situation, how can you describe it? Do the ports along the Mediterranean resemble the myth of the coexistence, or are they more like closed ports dominated by these monolithic cultural groups?
The ports, yes, indeed. I should say that they've lost that characteristic of convivencia, but on the other hand, you could say that the character of ports anyway, and this is a universal problem. It's something which I deal with in my other big book, the book about the oceans. Ports are no longer places where communities of that sort coexist happily, because all the work to do with the maritime dimension of the economy is now done by a small number of really highly skilled workers working with enormous machines. And the world, if you go back to Salonika in the 1920s, 1930s, who ran the port in Salonika? It was these Jews who spoke Judeo-Spanish, Ladino. They'd been speaking it for hundreds of years. And the city then sort of buzzed that they were part of a city which contained Bulgarians and Greeks and Turks and all sorts of other people. But think also of New York with its enormous community of dock workers who kept going on strike in the 1950s, 1960s. But none of that is necessary nowadays. We're now looking at a world in which machines will do it all. And we're even talking about maritime trade being conducted by cargo ships, container ships, which won't have any crew on board. They'll be controlled from Chengdu or somewhere in the middle of China. So ports themselves have changed very significantly in their social character.